all of you have been invited at the instance of PUCL Maharashtra, which is hosting this meeting.
I'm probably in the mode of conversation with Manoj. Let it be on book. As I said, it's beyond book. Now, we say that one of the points that runs through the book is that this how the legislative, judicial system was prejudiced against social reform. Okay? Is it not an axiom that these prejudices still run unobstructed? And as I already said, that probably they have gone in, meaning increased in their pervasiveness, if not intensity. Okay? So, where are we? You see any, it is not confined to legislation, judiciary. Mihir also touched upon what goes on in higher so-called constitutional courts, etc. So these prejudices are not confined only to that. This actually touches upon everything, like all institutions of state as well as civil society. We do see that caste consciousness runs so pervasively everywhere, as if like there is an air, in this country. So what are we talking about?
Has it not intensified?
It's an axiom like that caste consciousness is everywhere.
Yeah. So you're asking me if I agree with that.
So you would say, yeah, take it any way you like.
Yeah, I'll try to answer your question this way through the stories that I narrate in this book. Because let me clarify at the outset that unlike my co-panelists, I have no airs of being an expert on the subject. I am not an academic. I am merely a journalist, and I come from this tradition of facts being sacred and opinion being free, and we are essentially trained as storytellers. We believe that storytelling can be very effective in conveying our point. We don't necessarily theorize, we don't give you solutions, but it's for you to infer whatever you can from those stories. Stories that are very telling, stories that are unknown. So that's the spirit in which I did it. Now, to refer to the specific question that Professor Teltumbre just now put to me, what brings to my mind is, this point I make quite clearly in the book, that this violence, mass violence that the last two chapters deal with, was a phenomenon that India witnessed only post-independence. It wasn't there during the colonial period at all. It is not something that, say, Gandhi encountered in his lifetime, though Gandhi was so deeply involved in this battle against untouchability. Untouchables in his time did not face this kind of mass violence. The instances that began with, the trend that began with, say, Kelvamani in 1968 in Madras, that really set the template for mob, attacking Dalits in remote places. And there were, of course, one odd instances like, say, Ramabai colony, which somebody like Anand here has dealt with through his documentary. Barring such rare instances, most of these happen to be in rural areas, and this is a trend that began essentially in 1968. That is, after the lifetime of not only Gandhi and Nehru, but even Gandhi and Ambedkar, but even Nehru. And then this Kelvamani episode also set a template for impunity, because as was pointed out by Mihir earlier, that when the High Court dealt with it, it exonerated all the accused on the flimsiest of grounds, saying that, these are all well-heeled people, they couldn't possibly have been involved in this kind of violence. They are all people who own cars. I mean, it's hard to believe that they could have been there in that village on the street engaging in this kind of violence. Such was the quality of reasoning that was employed, and that again set a template, because you see similar reasoning, right into the 20th century, right into the 21st century. There were these series of incidents that took place in Bihar, Batani Tola. Lakshmanpur Bate deserves special mention because it is considered the biggest ever instance of mass violence targeting Dalits. Some 58 people were killed, and the then President K.R. Narayanan called it a national shame. And then the High Court, when the trial court deals with it, it goes on to award life sentence to a whole lot of people, and even death sentence. It's some, I don't offhand recall the figure, it's some 20 odd people, and it has the distinction of being the case with the highest number of death penalties awarded, by the trial court, more than even in Godra, a case that we are also familiar with because of the role it played in the history of our country, right? So now that same case, when it goes to the High Court, the Patna High Court, and this happened in the 21st century, every one of the accused is acquitted. So this, and again, for the flimsiest of reasons, I won't go into those reasons because we don't have that kind of time, but the larger point I wish to make is that this trend that I was talking about is striking parallel to what US saw in the 19th century. When with the abolition of slavery in 1860s, first through that presidential proclamation and then through the 13th Amendment, then there was a period of reconstruction, as they call it, for a few years. Then there was a pushback from the white supremacists, through which, it took the form of a whole lot of segregation laws. The system of slavery was replaced by segregation because these white supremacists couldn't accept this notion of equality, couldn't, countenance the idea of, blacks sitting at the same table, going to the same school, going to, sitting in the same buses. So they introduced the segregation laws, and when that was challenged in the Supreme Court, there was Supreme Court at that time in US gave a very perverse ruling saying that, so long as there is equality, separation is all right. The separate but equal doctrine that they introduced. And it took 5 decades for the US Supreme Court to realize that what is separate is inherently unequal. Through another landmark judgment called Brown versus Board of Education in 1950s it came. Now that was the trajectory of that country. But the point I'm making here is about violence, right? So this violence that US saw, large scale violence that US saw against blacks was only after the abolition of slavery. It was not there during the time of slavery because there was an institutionalized legal form of suppressing them. So, and it was something that they would dare not do. And here suddenly when there is equality and when there were these assertions of equality, there was a pushback from supremacists. And that took the form of race riots, that took the form of lynchings. These are all post-abolition of slavery phenomena. Likewise, in India, till there was, a legalized form of untouchability, and that was indeed the case till formally till 1950, and it continued to be the case for a long time because, the then government, this is probably a very uncomfortable reality for us who are of a liberal disposition to face, that, I say in my book that when one looks at these caste battles for equality in Hindu India, as I put it, Gandhi does not necessarily or does not always come across as Mahatma, and likewise you would find it very surprising that when these big debates were going on, say in the Constituent Assembly on the abolition of untouchability, you would think that people like Nehru would participate in it because it is dealing with something that is such a defining feature of our society, of our country, and there's no way a man of his stature, who was already Prime Minister, would not address it. But no, in the Constituent Assembly on debates relating to caste, different aspects of caste, temple entry and other aspects, he's not there at all, right? And you see that kind of indifference or this whole, naive assumption that caste is something that will be subsumed by class issues. So over a period of time, modernity will take care of it, or whatever drove that. So when the Nehru government introduces this first ever legislation against untouchability, called Untouchability Offences Act in 1954, right? This was to give flesh to the abolition of untouchability. Article 17 of the Constitution, which said that this will now be an offence and this will be a crime. So this law was meant to define those offences and it was meant to lay down penalties, right? And the then Home Minister, Kajju, who was the grandfather of Justice Kajju, who we are all familiar with. Now when he introduces this law, when he is piloting this legislation, now piloting the legislation would mean he is like a salesperson, I have this good to sell to you. So he will sing the praises, sing praises of that good and say, look, this is what I want you to buy. This is what I want you guys, legislators, to sell, right? This is what invariably happens. But no, that's not what happened when this legislation was being introduced. They made no bones about their unwillingness to introduce this. This Kajju goes on to say, look, this is something that I am forced to, majburi mein mujhe karna pad raha hai. Waise to there is no need for such a legislation because I believe in the Gandhian method, which is through change of heart. Let's persuade people to get over this prejudice. That will take care of this issue of caste and untouchability and all that. Now, he therefore, this was his way of justifying the very mild penalties that were introduced, just maximum penalty of 6 months imprisonment, and worse, an alternative penalty which is monetary. It is not said, it is not put as, okay, this plus this. You have the option of giving imprisonment or just monetary penalty, and there's no lower limit fixed at all. So technically, one could have been just, if there is evidence that was irrefutable, the judge could have just given 1 rupee penalty and disposed of that case. And that's exactly what Ambedkar feared, who was by then an opposition member in Rajya Sabha. He was appointed to the select committee that was supposed to deal with it, and the convention is that whoever is appointed to the select committee would not participate in the proceedings in the plenary session, because he would anyway get an opportunity to look at it as a member of that committee, scrutinize the provisions and make his contribution there. But then he said, I wouldn't mind giving up that option of being in the select committee because this is too outrageous a thing. I can't let this go unchallenged. And the kind of scathing attack he launches on the Nehru government. He says, it appears that this Home Minister himself wants to commit the offense of untouchability. Why else would he run down the very bill that he was apparently piloting, and why else would he, put such mild provisions? Why is he being so solicitous about these people? And this was not something out of the blue. There was, for a long time, whenever this issue of penalizing untouchability came up, again and again the tendency that was shown was you have to be a little understanding about it, about the fact that forever this was part of our custom. This was something that we believed was part of our religious ethos, our right. We can't let these people come close to us because our custom, our religious belief tells us that we are polluted by their presence. And in South, it was so bad that it was not just untouchability. What you saw in South was an aggravated form of untouchability, which was called unapproachability. And this was so peculiar to the South that when somebody like Vivekananda went on his Bharat Darshan before he went to Chicago, he reaches Malabar area, which is part of Kerala, and he's shocked out of his wits to see something that he had not come across anywhere else in the country. It was beyond his imagination. So he says this whole area is a lunatic asylum. I've never seen anything like this. What he was referring to is this unapproachability. He doesn't even have to be close to him. He doesn't even have to touch him. It's not untouchability. Just the fact that he was walking on the same street would be polluting to me. So that was the kind of, culture we were dealing with. So the attitude of the orthodox elements was, look, you can't suddenly expect what was always our religious, right, what was our religious core belief to be criminalized. You can't expect that to be acceptable to us. How is that a crime? So this is the point that even somebody like Karju was making on behalf of, he was the Home Minister, on behalf of the Nehru government. This was the attitude that the Indian Republic displayed in its nascent phase. So is it any surprise that, the weakness, that the softness that the establishment showed to this problem, emboldened the dominant sections. And when under the influence of people like Ambedkar, when these weaker sections were becoming more and more assertive, the pushback became more and more manifest, and it finally took the form of, as I said, the trend of mass violence which started in 1968, right? So to cut a long story short, the problem in certain clear ways have intensified post-independence, post-abolition of untouchability. I mean, that's an irony that we have to recognize and deal with. So I don't know if that answers your question. Sorry for giving such a long answer.
Question I